So hi everyone, and welcome. I'm Katie Pfohl. I'm the curator of contemporary art at the New Orleans Museum of Art. And I'm so excited to be here today to talk with Diedrick Brackens, who is a Los Angeles-based weaver and who just completed two really remarkable commissions for the museum's collection. Hi, Diedrick.
Hey,
Thanks for being here. It's so good to see your face.
you too.
Well, I'm, especially I think excited to talk to you today. As we were talking about just a minute ago, it feels like a lot of the ideas you're asking your work, a lot of the mediums that you're working with feel really resonant in this moment where we're thinking about self and identity and slowness and the body and our connection to home in certain respects. And I thought we'd start just by hearing a little bit from you, if you wouldn't mind, about how you came to weaving as a medium and the ways that you work with it.
Yeah, I started weaving just by almost accident. Or I guess like the sort of meeting of chance and fate is how I think about it now. But I had a professor in undergrad who sort of pushed me to take a fiber class. And at the time, I had not heard of fiber or textiles in this sort of capacity as an art material. But I took a weaving class the summer of 2008 and fell immediately in love with the tool, the materials, the color, the textures, and the sort of meditative, process-driven thing that sort of encompasses the whole sort of tool and medium.
Yeah, absolutely. Stop this for a minute. It's really amazing. So can you tell us a little bit more about your process in making the pieces that you created for NOMA, how you came to the ideas behind them, and some of the questions you're asking or exploring with the works?
Yeah, so I spent um, 2 months in New Orleans in 2016.
No,
Uh,
really? Okay.
that seems like a lifetime ago. And I had never really spent that much time in the city and got to look at the landscape, the folks, the sort of culture that was there in a real way before that. And I think that one of the things that struck me uh, about the place and sort of I continued to gravitate towards were any of the things that felt familiar um, to sort of like my neck of the South, and the sort of abundance of water in the landscape. So it just was almost that you could not turn in any direction and go forward for very long before you were sort of at a river, at a lake, bayou, or some audio. And I have, like, in my practice for a while, thought a lot about a particular lake in my hometown, and so I think I started to gravitate to these sites in this other sort of locale. And so the first work, God, Bin Bao Pool. I should know the name of my own work.
Waiting
Um,
still.
yes, waiting still.
I think the curator is usually in charge of remembering the title, right? And
um,
bend, bow, pull, right?
yes, yes. um, was I started to then collect the water from these sources and then use that to dye my yarn. So a part of my weaving practice, I do dye all of the yarns, and try to get involved in every sort of step of the process. And the materiality of sort of cotton and other specific yarns and tools have been instrumental in imparting concept into the work for me. And so water was another chance to make this intervention. So I started to collect water, use it to dye, and think about the ways that it was imparting something sort of alchemical to the works. And I really thought of the abstract work, Waiting Still, Bin Bao Pool, as sort of a map of this location. So I started to use water from the Mississippi as well as water from um, Lake Pontchartrain and like the kind of headwaters of the Mississippi meeting the Gulf. And so I was really thinking about how these things affect that place and city. Um, yeah. So that's sort of how I came to, in some ways, make that first work. And then with the second work, it was really a chance for me to revisit um, a lot of the things that I was thinking about in writing while I was in New Orleans, dialoguing with you in the museum and getting to look at the collection, as well as things that were sort of embedded in sort of my own personal inquiries around water and catfish, and uh, then again trying to bring in that connection to the landscape. So the title of this is If You Feed a River, which is sort of a shortening of a longer form sort of poetic writing that I had done at the time. And I wanted to think about um, these catfish as sort of, for me, have come to be ancestral figures. There are these kind of spirit guides. And I think about all the ways that they've been sort of thought of as bottom feeders, that they belong to Southern traditions around cuisine in specific. But the sort of myth or lore of them, I think, is sort of like lacking or forgotten as it relates to sort of creatures that inhabit the South and the ways that they get all of these sort of folk tales and characteristics imparted upon them. So I've really been interested in kind of filling that space with them as and the figures that are also populating the weavings.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that really drew me to your work from the very beginning when we first started working together was the way that it felt so tied to this sort of specifically Southern tradition, thinking about histories of Southern quilt making, Gee's Bend, thinking about the landscape and the fraught history of the landscape in the American South, where you're from in Texas, as well as Louisiana and beyond, but also was so tied to this, like you say, much more kind of global, all-encompassing thinking about self and identity, whether that means, you know, mixing African kente cloth patterns with like Google map freeways in your abstract work, or
Right.
in these figures here where like the catfish, which means something very specific in New Orleans and in the broader Gulf South, comes to be this larger metaphor for questions around identity and value and how we think about those ideas. And I don't know, one of the things that was so interesting is that when we first started working together, right, you were making almost entirely abstract work. And then in the time between we worked together on the first piece and now, you ventured almost exclusively into this incredible, more figurative work, which has a lot more specific kinds of references and to, I think, a lot of the questions that you're asking. Can you talk a little bit about that transformation and why you started working more with figures and sort of some of the meanings behind the split figure that we see in this piece here?
Yeah, so I think some of the earliest moments of sort of making art, I was really interested in sort of like I didn't understand or see a difference between making abstraction and figuration. And then I think I got to a point where I started to um, realize that like after I'd made a figurative thing and it went out into the world, the ways that it could be read felt like they didn't leave a lot of room for what I maybe intended in the beginning. That there are ways that they were read um, under these that folks would see things in them that I was not imparting, and so I think I backed away from figuration because I had this what I think of as a very like painterly idea that like abstraction could say everything. So I started to sort of try to tease out the same ideas through abstraction. But even if in those moments, I was always finding myself trying to articulate the body through sort of openings or tears or um, notions that you would use on a shirt, like a button or a zipper, to like invoke the body again in these abstractions. So I think I slowly hedged my way back to figuration through these abstract works. And the first abstraction or figurative work that I've made, um, I would say, like as a mature artist, really was in response to seeing the film Moonlight,
Mm.
which was like filled with this water imagery, and it was as though like at any moment I just felt like the screen was gonna like burst because there was like bathtubs and ocean and all of these things sort of inundating the screen, and it was, I would say, like on the heels of kind of thinking through like the moments of Black Lives Matter and like police or extrajudicial killings of like Black folks in America that were the headlines. It was sort of like um, empowering and like restorative to see these Black bodies on the screen that weren't a part of that story, and were sort of telling this kind of interior story that I felt was getting so left out, like as though there were these awful things, but there was nothing beyond that being shown to the general public or to myself. So I just wanted to make a weaving in that kind of same spirit, and I think it that Moonlight was also kind of heralding this like age of like new age of Black cinema, or a return to sort of Black bodies on the screen telling these amazing and interesting and diverse sets of stories. And I was like, oh, I want to make a contribution to that. And I think that is what sort of triggered the beginning of figuration for me, um, and like a kind of return to it. Although I still feel like I want both of the things to be um, have some sort of valence, but which is, I don't know, a hard thing to navigate with folks.
Well, I mean, my favorite way to see your work, as you know, is with one of each, which is why we have both.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that relationship is so interesting, right? Because in some ways, the act of weaving is always already an abstraction, right? Yes, these figures come together in the
Yeah.
pattern that we created, but they're still composed of these kind of intersecting lines and threads that come together into form, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I think, I don't know, I mean, for me, that idea of weaving and that metaphor of kind of, you know, like being interwoven, being connected across time and space, that you can have these, I think, really incredibly intimate pieces that make you think of home and the body and self, like you say. They're these interior landscapes, but they're always already about the way that these interior landscapes and the way these sort of spaces that you're creating are so connected to much broader global range of references and ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really have been thinking a lot myself about how these ideas of like figuration and abstraction, especially as it relates to what I'm doing, aren't stable. Like that the even in their sort of describing bodies, like there's so much that gets lost and added, and even describing the landscape, like there are parts of the weavings that feel to me very like quilterly, that they get cut up and put back together, and there are moments where information falls out and information is added, and not to an end of sort of trying to depict a thing
Right.
in its reality, but like suspending that idea for the potential of like what can happen in that sort of fuzzy space.
Can you talk a little bit about If You Feed a River in particular, and especially this kind of split and doubled figure that you see on either
Yeah,
side of the
yeah. I think it's two things. So um, not to sound like very woo woo and spiritual, but it probably will. That's fine. I I think I start each work with an idea of where it's going, and then as I weave and sew and put things together, I allow for like that moment of chance or improvisation to happen. So in the beginning, it was these two figures that are at the edges were united in the middle of the weaving. But once I started weaving and making it and sort of piecing it back together, it it didn't it was not what the weaving wanted to do, like both in a very process sense, like it was not didn't feel balanced. It didn't look right to me. Although that was the way I conceived it on paper. So I moved everything around so that the figures were sort of split. And for me, it felt like this sense of thinking about in the way that the fish are sort of oscillating in that circle there on the right hand side, thinking about these figures sort of reaching across this kind of gap or this river to sort of unite with each other. Felt like it sort of was doing that same thing. And the sort of background figure for me is the river. So thinking about this idea of like river feeding you, you feeding river, um, felt important to think about it as sort of this ghost or spirit or thing that is not passive, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean that idea, I think, you know, a lot of the work being done at this moment, thinking about water and climate and all of these questions in this region isn't
Yeah,
so much framed in that way around this idea of this kind of like intimate personal connection, but also this idea of reciprocity, right? That you have to give, you have to feed, you have to offer in order to receive. And I thought that was something that was really incredible about this piece, that it made that case in such a kind of poetic and beautiful way that, you know, that in some ways our connection to environment is about an embrace, right?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's something about wanting to, I mean, intrinsically about wanting to save or rehab a natural space, and is that it is often generous, and it is about, as much as that space, it's about other people having it or having access to it. Hopefully. Anyways, yeah.
So do you have, I mean, I know we're kind of just embarking on this very strange, uncertain time for all of us. And um, I guess, you know, I mean, I'm wondering sort of what you're doing now and what you're thinking about. I know that you've had projects that have been put on hold, and kind of all of us are in this moment of thinking about how we move forward and what we do with the time that we have. I've been making
Yeah,
bread mostly personally.
yeah.
I'm writing.
I've been making pickles.
I mean, if you know, kind of how you as an artist are trying to think into this moment. We
um
just started. I know it's a big question. I'm sorry.
No, it is a big question, but I think it is the question that everyone is asking themselves. So I feel like it's worth trying to take a stab at it. Um, I mean, I think for me, the truth is that it is allowing me more time to think. Like I would say that I am always thoughtful about the things that I produce and what I want them to say and where I want them to go. But I think often that comes with a lot of concessions by virtue of just the way that our world works and the speed at which it goes. And right now, I feel like um, I really have time to like be more precise and clear. And um, for me, that looks like writing. That looks like spending more time in the studio, trying out technical things. Um, and it looks like rest, like in a way that I'm unfamiliar with, to be honest. So that is the thing that I'm trying to accept as the gift in like a time that is like really, really hard and challenging, is um, that I can absolutely like turn off and like not do a lot of things, and like deadlines that were here are now here. So what can get built into that schedule is pretty supreme. Um, yeah. I gave myself a pedicure the other day, and I'm like, I've never done that. I didn't have time for
Oh,
that.
yeah, that is, it seems like a good moment as an artist to have a practice that is very time based and like very laborious, right? It's like, I know just from, our work together, how long it takes you to make this work. And I feel like
Yeah.
you have in your mind like this practice of slowness already set in the way that you make and think and work. So I've been a little bit of jealous of that the last couple of days.
Right. And I guess to me, I feel like part of the hard part of answering it, beyond like what I was saying, which can sound flowery and is some version of what everyone is probably going through, is like, this is not far and away different from what my normal life is like, besides the fact that I can't go out and see people in the afternoons. Like, it is a very slow process. There's already a sort of level of acceptance to like this speed of life. um and it's just nice that I can like add to that like a home cooked meal and a pedicure. It's sort of augmented what was already happening. And I think what I want to take away is that like, how can I maintain some parts of this once we're back to whatever normal is.
Yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
like that importance of kind of like care at
Yeah.
the center of what we do, for sure.
Hmm. Yeah.
Eric, thank you so much for
Yeah.
talking to me today. It's really awesome to. We were talking before we started talking. Diedrick and I were saying, one of the things that is sort of beautiful about this moment is there would be no other reason for us to talk today, and I feel really lucky.
Yeah.
Right? That everyone is reaching out and reaching across, and like thinking about connections and past projects and work and all of that. And I feel
Yeah.
really lucky to have the chance to revisit that with you today. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Bye. See you later.